He wore the uniform, carried the badge, and believed it made him untouchable. For years, people looked away, too afraid to challenge his power. But one day, he targeted the wrong woman, someone he thought was powerless, someone he thought no one would defend. What unfolded inside that courtroom would shatter his illusion of control and expose a deeper truth about justice, race, and the abuse of authority. This isn't just his downfall, it's a story about how silence breaks and how one act of courage can ripple far beyond a single trial. The question is, how much damage was done before the world finally listened? For most people, the courtroom was just a place they saw on TV. But for Mariah, it was her workplace, her sanctuary, and, on most days, a symbol of order. She was a young professional, dedicated, the kind of woman who stayed late to finish a brief or double-checked every detail before filing. Her colleagues admired her calm persistence, and though she never spoke about it, she carried the weight of being one of the few black women in her position. Every morning, she walked through those courthouse doors with quiet dignity, knowing eyes often followed her, not always with respect, but always with judgment. Still, she endured, pushing past whispers and assumptions because she believed in the law. She believed in fairness. But that belief was about to be tested. On an ordinary Tuesday, with files tucked under her arm and deadlines filling her mind, she found herself face to face with a man who thought his badge gave him more power than truth. What started as another routine day inside the courthouse would soon unravel into a confrontation that went far beyond legal arguments. Mariah didn't know it yet, but she was about to become the center of a case that exposed just how fragile justice could be when prejudice hid behind authority. The moment he entered the courtroom, Mariah felt it, the shift in the air. The officer stood tall, shoulders squared, a smug half-smile plastered on his face. He wasn't just there to testify, he was there to dominate the room. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol he had long treated as armor. To him, it wasn't just metal, it was immunity. Mariah sat across from him, carefully laying out her files. She had seen arrogance before, but this was different. This was intimidation disguised as procedure. The officer leaned back in his chair, as if the entire process was beneath him, his gaze fixed on her with a mix of contempt and challenge. He believed she was out of her depth, that she didn't belong here, that the courtroom was his territory, not hers. The first question seemed routine, but beneath every answer there was a shadow, a refusal to respect her authority, a deliberate twisting of facts, as if the truth itself bowed to his uniform. When Mariah pressed him for clarity, his tone sharpened, dismissive, almost mocking. The judge shifted uneasily, the jurors exchanged glances, and still the officer smirked. Outside those walls, his reputation was well known. He had a history of incidents, complaints that disappeared into silence, stories whispered but never proven. Most never made it past paperwork. He counted on that silence. He fed on it. But this time was different, because Mariah wasn't intimidated. She saw through the performance, the polished lies delivered with the confidence of someone who had gotten away with too much for too long. She noticed the inconsistency stacking up, the cracks forming in his carefully rehearsed story. Still, she also noticed something else, the way the courtroom itself seemed to bend toward him. When he laughed off her questions, no one stopped him. When he leaned across the table, closer than he should have, the bailiff looked the other way. And in those moments, Mariah understood the real danger wasn't just his arrogance, it was the system that allowed it to breathe. Her chest tightened as she shuffled through her notes. Every second felt heavier, every exchange more dangerous. One mistake, one hesitation, and the truth could vanish beneath the weight of his authority. She could feel the jurors watching, not just listening to his words, but absorbing his confidence. If they believed him, everything she had built could collapse. And then, as if to seal his dominance, he did something unexpected. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, voice low but sharp enough to cut the silence. The words weren't directed at the judge, the jury, or even the case. They were directed at her. It wasn't evidence he was presenting, it was a warning. The room froze. No one intervened. No one called him out. Mariah's pulse hammered in her ears. She realized she wasn't just fighting for a case anymore. She was standing in a room where her very presence was being challenged, where her identity itself was treated as evidence against her. And that's when she understood. If she faltered here, even for a second, it wouldn't just be her loss, it would be a victory for every unchecked abuse of power that had come before him. The question wasn't whether she could prove her case. The question was, could she survive the storm that was about to break wide open? The courtroom had grown tense, the air heavy with silence. Every eye was fixed on the officer as he leaned in once more, his voice rising not in defense, but in domination. He dismissed Mariah's evidence, scoffed at her persistence, and then, in a single moment that cut through the room, he lashed out. His words weren't just disrespectful, they dripped with venom, laced with a kind of prejudice that stripped away any doubt about who he believed she was and where he thought she belonged. The words echoed across the chamber, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Some jurors lowered their gaze, others shifted uncomfortably. The judge hesitated, tapping the gavel but failing to truly intervene. And Mariah stood frozen, not because she was surprised, but because the mask had finally slipped. The arrogance, the untouchable shield of the badge, it all cracked open in that instant, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. It should have been the moment someone stepped in, the moment authority corrected itself. But instead, silence pressed in harder than the words themselves. The system looked away, just as it had so many times before. Mariah tightened her grip on her notes, her knuckles white. She felt the weight of generations pressing against her shoulders, voices silenced before they could be heard. And yet, in that unbearable moment of exposure, she also knew something had shifted. The officer had revealed his truth, and though the room pretended not to hear it, the seed was planted. This was no longer just a trial, it was a revelation, a raw, unfiltered display of the power imbalance that so many denied. And Mariah, though shaken, understood. The very thing meant to break her had just given her the weapon to fight back. The question now wasn't whether the world would see it, it was whether they would finally admit what had been there all along. When the verdict was read, the officer still wore his smirk, convinced the system would shield him as it always had. But the room had shifted. The jurors, once hesitant, could no longer ignore the cracks in his story. The arrogance he wielded so freely had betrayed him, and for the first time, accountability pierced through the armor of his badge. Mariah walked out of that courthouse with her head high, but the scars of the trial would remain. She had carried more than a case. She had carried the weight of being doubted, dismissed, and disrespected simply for who she was. And though she stood victorious, she knew this wasn't a victory that erased the pain. It was a reminder of just how fragile justice could be when prejudice was allowed to shape it. Her story became a whisper turned into a roar. People who had once stayed silent began to speak. Others who had suffered in the shadows saw themselves in her struggle. And the officer, who believed his badge made him untouchable, became a symbol of something far greater, the danger of unchecked power when laced with racism. But here's the truth, Mariah's fight is not just hers. It echoes through every courtroom, every street corner, every place where silence tries to bury injustice. The system may bend, but it doesn't break on its own. It takes courage to stand, to speak, to refuse to be erased. So, ask yourself, how many more Mariahs will it take before silence is no longer an option? How many more lives must bear the weight of prejudice before accountability becomes the norm, not the exception? Because this story may have ended in one courtroom, but the fight it represents continues everywhere. And the next chapter is up to us.